Alrighty. In this video, I want to talk a little bit more about bind, but the first thing I want to do is I have a bit of a interesting sort of exercise that I would like to see if people can figure out, because we've seen enough of bind already. Just to recap, we have call, apply, and bind. And call and apply both immediately execute the function that we passed in, allowing us to change the context as well as allowing us to pass in parameters. Whereas bind, as you see right here, allows us to kind of attach this arg to a function, allowing us to invoke that function but have the context bound to something else. So I want to see if you guys can. And before I do this, I just want to introduce one more thing about JavaScript. So we'll do example 9, my function. And one more thing about JavaScript is that there's a special object available inside of functions called arguments. So I can do console log arguments. And the arguments object is a list of all the arguments passed into the function. So let's do like 1, 2, and then I do my function 1, 2. Hit Control S, and notice how the arguments array, it's actually not an array. Funny enough, it actually, as you see, the prototype is an object. It's not an array, but it's what's called array-like in JavaScript. So we see the arguments as an array-like thing that contains all the arguments passed in. An interesting behavior of arguments is it doesn't matter if these parameters are formally declared or not. I can pass in any arbitrary amount of arguments into this function, and they'll all appear inside of the arguments object, okay? So that's how you access those arguments. What I want you guys to do is I want you guys to write a function myBind that takes in a func and a this arg. And I want this myBind function to work like this. I want to be able to say var log equals myBind console.log console, and I want to be able to do log hello world. So as you see, log is not a function because we're not returning anything from myBind. So with your knowledge of call and apply, I want to see if people can implement a bind function in terms of those that behave similarly, although not exactly, but similarly to the actual bind function itself. So if you want to pause the video and think about it a little bit, otherwise I'll start to kind of walk you guys through how you might go about doing this sort of thing. So first of all, we know... we already know we have to return a function, right? So the myBind function, bind returns a function. It creates a new function. It kind of creates a wrapper around a function. So we know we have to start off with return function. And then inside of here, now we really only need one line of code. And remember, we implement myBind in terms of apply and call, or can. But now the decision is, so we know we need to invoke this func. This func parameter needs to be invoked with the this arg. And we already know how to do that. We know about call and we know about apply. But think for a second of which one you would need and why. Well, in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to do func dot apply this arg followed by arguments. Hit Control S and it works. We've created our own poor man's version of the bind function. And the reason we use apply, of course, is because the call. See, if I did call, what's going to happen is, interestingly enough, it looks similar, but it's not. Let's go back to apply. Look at what apply prints. Now look at what call prints. Now think for a second why there would be a difference there in the display. So again, apply prints a string. Call prints an array of a string. They look similar, but they're really not. Let's pass in multiple arguments to see what happens. Hello world, blah, stuff. With call, we get a single array, hello world, blah, and stuff. With apply, we get 3 individual strings, hello world, blah, and stuff. And I'm kind of trying to hammer this in because I get call and apply mixed up all the time. So it's really important to understand the difference. And the difference is, of course, when we call, what we're doing here is we're calling console.log followed by arguments. But when we do apply, we're doing console.log arguments 0, arguments 1, arguments 2, and then so on and so on and so on for however many arguments there are. So that's really the important difference. Apply expands a single parameter, that it's an array, into each one of the individual parameters that goes into the function, whereas call does not. So remember, this is call, this is apply. I did see an interesting mnemonic on Stack Overflow where you where call, you count the arguments, apply, you use an array. So the A in apply is for array. It wants an array of arguments, a single parameter that's an array of arguments, whereas call wants multiple parameters that'll be passed through. Okay, so that is an example of binding. So let's look at one more thing with bind, because I haven't. There's one more thing in the actual bind function that's not present here in our poor man's version of bind, but is present in the actual one, and I want to talk about that for a second. So let's go ahead and do example 10, and this is an interesting thing actually. What I'm about to show you is an example of what's referred to in the functional world as currying, and currying is I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Currying is a ability to take a function, partially fill in the argument list, and then get back a new function that has all of those parameters already pre-filled in. So for example, if we had a function add that took in a left and a right and simply returned left plus right, let's say we wanted to create a let's say that we had an array and we wanted to add 5 to each one of these items in the array and get back a new array. So I'm going to introduce another function on arrays. I'm going to say console log. The way you would normally do this, or normally think to do this, would be array.map function item, return item, what did I say, 5, so item plus 5, and we're going to get 6, 7, 8, 9, blah, blah, blah. So we've added 5 to each item. So the array.map function is a higher order function that's similar to the for each function, but for every item, it allows you to modify that value, and it returns a copy of the array with the modified values. So that's what mapping does. But I can use the bind function to actually clear this up a lot, because now instead of doing that, I can say console log array.map add.bind null 5, and we get the same value. So what I'm doing here is, if you look at the signature, the bind function takes in additional arguments, just like it's similar to call in that it'll take in additional arguments that in a comma separated list, not an individual array. So when I do something like var add 5 equals add bind null or undefined or whatever, comma 5, I now have a new function with the first parameter already applied. This is called partial function application. And I can say console log add 5 10, and I'll get obviously 15. So I've created a new function with one of those arguments pre-filled in, so I only have to specify one argument. Because obviously if I did console log add 10, that would make no sense, because we're invoking this function, but our second argument is undefined. So what is undefined plus a number? It's NaN, or not a number. But if I do some currying, if I do some partial function application, I'm able to use the bind function to pre-fill in one of those values. And what's really cool about the using the bind function for this, you'll more often use this in more advanced code, more functional code, where you wanted to simplify an operation like this. Like you wanted to perform an operation on every single item of an array, but the operation you want to perform needs like 3 parameters. So what you do is you'd use bind to curry that function and pre-fill in 2 of those parameters so that the third parameter is applied to by each item in the array. And you can use this for an arbitrary amount of parameters. I can do function, I don't know, concat left middle right. And I can say console log left plus middle plus right. And then I can say var concat hello world equals concat bind undefined hello world. And now I can say concat hello world test. So in this case, you'll notice that's going to, and I can spell good. In this case, you'll see it's going to say hello world test because I've partially applied these two arguments. But you'll notice it might be interesting that I'm passing an undefined and null as the first parameter. That's because in these cases, I don't care about the context. I don't care what the this parameter is in the context of invoking the function. The reason I don't is because we're not using this in this case. We're simply partially applying things. But you can mix and match, obviously. You can use bind to both partially apply a function and bind it to a particular context. And that is call, apply, and bind. So just to recap, call and apply and bind are used to manipulate the context of which a function is executed under, regardless of how that function is invoked. So we're superseding the rule that a function's this context refers to the left-hand side of the dot notation when it's invoked. We're superseding that by overriding it with call, apply, and bind. The difference between call and apply is apply needs an array, whereas call needs a list of parameters. And bind doesn't immediately invoke the function, but returns a new function that we can use. Furthermore, we saw an example of how we're able to steal functions. So like, right here, we stole the person.print name function from the person object, and we applied it to the person2 object. So we stole a function. And you'll see that used a lot as well in different JavaScript code. And I think that'll wrap up our discussion of call, apply, and bind. And in the next video, we're going to be talking about how a different way that we can manipulate this variable using arrow functions. And we'll see you guys then.